What would happen if a wealthy owner disguised himself as a nobody and got turned away by his own hotel simply because he didn't look the part? Have you ever walked into a luxurious place glowing with lights only to realize it's as if you don't exist at all? Not in the philosophical sense of being mere dust in a vast universe, but in a painfully real way. You are there, flesh and blood, yet no one seems to see you. That morning, Calvin Brooks, 49 years old, founder of the five-star hotel chain Sterling Haven, experienced that feeling in the most bitter way possible. No suit, no private driver, no respectful greetings, just a man in a hoodie, jeans, and an old backpack, standing in the lobby of one of the most expensive hotels in America. One he had built with his own bare hands. The scene before him felt completely foreign, a quiet but cold lobby, staff more engrossed in their own conversations than in serving guests. A security guard approached, eyeing him cautiously, as if Calvin were just looking for shelter from the rain. "You here for?" the man asked hesitantly. Calvin didn't answer, just offered a faint smile and stepped inside. He knew full well. If he revealed who he was, everything would change in an instant. But today, he wasn't here to be recognized. He was here to witness the truth. Calvin walked toward the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman with platinum blonde hair and long polished nails, was holding her phone, eyes glued to the screen. Once, twice, he tried to get her attention. "Excuse me," he said in a calm tone. No response. He tapped the counter lightly. She raised an eyebrow, glanced at him for all of 3 seconds, then sighed as if someone had disturbed her mid-break. "Name?" she asked, without so much as a greeting. "Calvin Brooks," he replied, his voice steady. She typed quickly, then snapped, "You're not in the system." No second look, no offer to double-check. Not a hint of courtesy. Just a simple message. "You don't exist here." Calvin stood silently for a moment. Not because he was shocked, but because he was familiar with this feeling. He had once been an anonymous black man looking for work. Had been rejected, not for lack of ability, but because of how people looked at him. He had worked 3 shifts back-to-back just to carve out a place in the world, and now in the very place he had built, he was being treated like someone who didn't belong. But this time, he didn't lower his head. He smiled gently, pulled out his phone, and opened his confirmation email. Before him, everything was about to change. But Brittany, the young woman behind the desk, had no idea she was about to walk into a night she would never forget. And Sterling Haven, once a symbol of perfection, was about to face a storm that had been brewing in the heart it chose to overlook. Calvin held out his phone, his finger gliding gently across the screen as he opened the confirmation email from the previous week. "I have the reservation right here," he said, showing it to Brittany. She glanced at it for barely a second, then shrugged. "The system doesn't lie," she said, her eyes vacant, her tone like a rehearsed excuse she had used hundreds of times. Calvin remained calm, but in his mind a far bigger question was forming. This wasn't a system error. This was deliberate. He spoke slowly. "Would you mind checking again? You might have typed the name incorrectly." Brittany raised an eyebrow, her fingers lazily tapping on the keyboard. "Brooks Calvin? Nope, not in here. You probably booked the wrong location. Happens a lot." Her voice shifted from indifferent to condescending. "People often confuse our hotel with some of the 3-star joints around here." That sentence hit like a slap across the face, but Calvin didn't flinch. Silently, he pulled out a second phone, black without a case, containing no personal apps, only an internal security system. It was his key to access the back end of Sterling Haven's reservation network. Calvin typed a few commands, entered a biometric code. Within seconds, the information appeared. "Reservation confirmed 7 days ago, payment completed, room 211, check-in today." And just below it, in glaring red text, "Deleted, actioned by Brittany Ellis, time 11:42 a.m. He looked at his watch. 11:45. She had just deleted it. A wave of silence passed through. What he felt wasn't anger. It was a piercing, cold disappointment. He had trained hundreds of staff on what it meant to serve from the heart, to see guests as people, not as numbers. And now, a staff member had deliberately erased him from the very space he created. simply because his appearance didn't match her expectations. Calvin raised his eyes to Brittany, and his gaze had changed. He was no longer the rejected guest. He was a man who knew the truth. He leaned slightly across the counter. "Miss Brittany, what if I told you I know exactly who deleted my reservation?" Brittany kept her eyes on the screen, not looking up. "The system doesn't log that kind of thing," she said. Calvin smiled and slowly turned his phone, revealing the action log on the screen. Brittany looked, blinked once, twice. Then her face changed color. Her name. The exact time. The deleted reservation. It was all there. She swallowed hard. For the first time that morning, she looked like a person who was truly afraid. Calvin spoke slowly. "You just deleted my existence from the system. Now I'm going to show you what happens when a person is erased." And with a faint smile, he took a single step back, preparing for what came next. A reckoning that would begin in the smallest of places. Calvin sat inside room 914, the one Brittany had called the only room available. The walls were damp, the window wouldn't open, and the air conditioner rattled with a clunky hum, as if reminding him he was not welcome here. But he wasn't here to rest. He was here to begin. As the door clicked shut behind him, he set his suitcase aside and opened his personal laptop. Not to catch up on work, but to investigate. The internal system of Sterling Haven tracked every complaint, every reservation, and every staff action in real time. Calvin opened the hotel's profile and filtered for negative reports past 6 months. The name Brittany Ellis immediately stood out like a warning flare. Reservations deleted without cause, guests denied check-in without explanation, repeated complaints about employee behavior, using the same terms over and over. Cold, discriminatory, condescending. Worse, several reports specifically mentioned racially biased behavior, but each one had been dismissed by branch manager Ronald Spears. Calvin's heartbeat slowed. He had seen this before. When people like Brittany were never held accountable, not because they went unnoticed, but because the person above them chose to look away. Ronald, a man well known for sidestepping responsibility and smoothing over issues to avoid conflict. He had even been praised by the executive board for being steady, image-conscious. And yes, he was steady, steadily shielding the ones causing harm, steadily preserving a glossy facade from ever cracking. Calvin dug deeper into the hidden files. Reports accessible only to senior executives. One complaint came from an elderly couple who had been denied a room for not having a valid credit card, yet they noted at the end, "A group of younger guests without cards were checked in right after us." And the one who processed both cases? Brittany. Her name appeared again and again like a silent accusation needing no further explanation. Leaning back in his chair, Calvin's eyes grew colder. This wasn't just a receptionist. This was a link in a rotting chain. One person making the mistake, one person covering it up, and an empire quietly corroding from the inside out while no one noticed. But he noticed. And this time, he would not look away. Calvin checked his watch. 45 minutes until the afternoon check-in rush. He closed the laptop, stood up, and adjusted the collar of his silver-gray hoodie. It was time for the true operator to step into the light. Not to receive reports, but to deliver a reckoning that would silence the entire building. The hotel lobby wasn't crowded at that hour, but it was just busy enough for a noticeable hush to fall when Calvin stepped up to the front desk. The soft golden lights reflected off his face, causing Brittany, the same receptionist who had just turned him away, to momentarily freeze. She kept her eyes on her phone, as if pretending he didn't exist. Calvin stood there quietly for a moment, then calmly spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried just enough weight to halt the movement around them. "Miss Brittany, I'd like to ask you something small." She looked up, trying to mask her surprise, then replied with the same practiced arrogance she wore like a uniform. "Yes?" Calvin tilted his head slightly, as if studying her expression. "Let's say a reservation suddenly disappeared from the system. What do you think happened?" Brittany shrugged. "Probably a software glitch. Our network's been a little unstable lately." On the surface, the answer seemed harmless. But to Calvin, it was a drop off the edge. Not because of the words, but because the lie came too easily. He didn't respond. He simply took out his phone, opened the admin interface, and turned the screen toward her. Displayed clearly was a line of text no one could mistake. Reservation number 77413. Deleted by Brittany Ellis, 11:42 a.m. Her name, the deletion, the exact time. She glanced at it, about to deny it, but her lips froze. Her eyes flickered, then steadied in forced composure. I don't recall doing that, she began. Calvin cut her off. His tone wasn't raised, but it landed with the force of a step onto cracking ice. You don't recall deliberately deleting my reservation, simply because I didn't look like someone who could afford to be here? A long silence followed. No one near the counter dared to even breathe. Brittany swallowed hard, her eyes darting. But Calvin didn't let her escape. Do you know how this system was built? Every action, every decision, every mistake leaves a trace. There's no such thing as a network glitch. There are only people who try to hide behind one, hoping no one's watching. She said nothing, staring at him as if realizing too late that she was standing before a mountain with no way around it. Calvin looked down at the name stitched on her uniform, then stepped back. His voice dropped, laced with quiet implication. Who did you think I was? And in that moment his gaze was sharp as a blade, but his presence remained calm and steady. He turned and walked away, leaving Brittany standing there like someone who hadn't been removed by another's hand, but undone by her own. This was only the beginning. And from this moment forward, he was no longer just another guest. He was the man who would peel back every mask that had been allowed to survive for far too long inside his own empire. The room keycard slid across the counter, and Brittany pushed it toward Calvin as if completing one last formality for a guest unworthy of attention. Room 913, she said quickly, then turned away without a word of explanation, without a glance. Calvin picked up the card, nodding slowly, his eyes fixed on the name stitched across her chest. Room 913. The number was familiar. He remembered every detail from the original blueprints years ago. The room sat right next to the maintenance closet, with walls so thin you could hear the water pump running all night, and its window faced directly toward the hotel's rear dumpster, a place no one would willingly stay in unless there was no other option. And today, it was the room he had been given. Not because the hotel was full, but because someone wanted to make a point. He was not welcome here. The hallway leading to the room was strangely quiet. His footsteps echoed low and steady, neither hurried nor slow. He swiped the card, and the door unlocked with a dull, heavy beep. Inside, everything was just as he expected. Dim yellow light, the scent of mildew rising from unsealed walls, and the mechanical clatter of equipment humming on the other side of the partition. Calvin set down his bag, not bothering to turn on the light. The glow from the window was enough to reveal the deliberate intention behind every detail. This was not oversight, it was a decision. And that decision had been made by an employee who believed she had the right to determine who deserved respect. Calvin walked to the window and drew the curtain. The view emerged. Rusting steel bins, torn plastic bags, the stench of burnt plastic and stagnant steam rising from the alley behind the hotel. He stared at it for a long time, not out of disgust, but out of clarity. In the world of luxury hotels, what brings downfall is not the lack of comfort, but the absence of heart. And today, someone had tried to place him in a room without heart, hoping he would stay silent, walk away, or turn a blind eye. But no, he had not come here to be defeated. Calvin opened his laptop. A few simple commands were entered. Every keystroke was a step toward removing the mask. The internal system lit up, revealing data on room conditions, assignment history, and the day's availability list. There were at least 12 better rooms, entirely vacant. Brittany hadn't given him room 913 because it was the only one available. She chose it because it was the worst. Calvin closed his eyes for a few seconds, not to rest, but to remember why he had built this empire in the first place. Not to create luxury, but to preserve dignity for anyone who walked through those doors. Today, that dignity had been insulted, and he would not allow that insult to become the standard. Room 913 would no longer be a space to cast aside. From this moment on, it would become the epicenter of a reckoning. A storm would rise from the place others had deemed the lowest. The next morning, as the hotel lobby began to bustle with the first wave of checkouts, Calvin stood in front of the manager's office. No one invited him. No one stopped him. He gave a single, soft knock, then pushed the door open, as if it were a space that had always belonged to him. Ronald Spears, the branch manager, sat behind his desk, his rosy face betraying a sense of complacency. He looked up with the usual practiced customer service smile, but the moment he saw Calvin, that smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of unease. "Good morning. Is there something I can help you with?" Ronald asked, trying to keep his voice composed. Calvin didn't sit. He placed his phone on the desk, turned the screen toward Ronald, and began to read aloud, one line at a time. 12 guest complaints in 3 months. Same front desk employee, same type of behavior. Not one report forwarded to headquarters. Not a single disciplinary action taken. His voice wasn't raised, wasn't angry, but it was sharp and cold as steel. Ronald glanced at the screen, his lips beginning to press into a thin line. I believe those were just misunderstandings. Brittany has experience and sometimes she can be a bit blunt, but... Calvin cut him off, not needing to hear the full excuse. Do you think the guests imagined the feeling of being discriminated against? Or do you believe she deserves to represent the face of Sterling Haven simply because she knows how to survive a shift? Ronald opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His expression suddenly mirrored Brittany's from the night before, uncertain, unsettled, and shrinking beneath the weight of truth. Calvin walked a slow circle around the desk, eyes never leaving the man seated before him. I've read every single one of your internal responses. You always end with the same line. Employee has been reminded, issue explained to guest. A hollow formula, emotionless. You didn't fix anything, Ronald. You just swept the dirt under the rug and hoped no one would step on it. Ronald lowered his head, hands clasped like a child caught red-handed. I was afraid of the ripple effects, afraid it would affect revenue. I just wanted to keep things stable. Calvin stopped directly in front of him. Stability does not mean turning a blind eye. Being a manager doesn't mean extinguishing fires with silence. It means protecting the flame of respect even in the midst of chaos. He took a breath, his voice softening into finality. You had your chance, many times, and you chose silence. From now on, silence will no longer be your right. A heavy silence fell across the room, thick like velvet drapes pulling down over everything. Ronald said nothing, because at this point every excuse was already empty, and no one knew that better than him. Less than 10 minutes after the conversation in the office, Ronald stepped out through the glass door, his face pale like a man who had just woken from a nightmare. He said nothing, simply adjusted his collar, took a deep breath, and walked straight to the front desk where Brittany was still standing, scrolling on her phone as if nothing had happened the night before. There were about 10 people in the lobby at that moment. A group of guests checking out, a few staff pushing luggage carts, and an assistant receptionist monitoring the security cameras. Everything seemed normal until Ronald spoke. Brittany Ellis. She looked up, slightly surprised that he used her full name, but she still wore that faint smirk. Yes? Ronald didn't waste words. You're terminated. Effective immediately. The air froze. A guest's spoon clinked onto the floor with a sharp, clear sound. Brittany glanced around, thinking it was a joke. Excuse me? For what? Ronald looked at her, and for the first time during his entire management tenure, spoke to an employee with a voice stripped of hesitation. For deliberately deleting a guest's reservation, for showing blatant disrespect, because Sterling Haven has no room for prejudice or carelessness. Brittany stiffened, her expression shifting from shock to fury. Who is he to get special treatment? He's just another guest. You can't, her voice cracked as she shouted. A few guests turned, whispering. A housekeeping staff member held their breath. Calvin remained at a distance, leaning casually against a marble pillar, arms folded. He didn't need to say anything. What needed to be revealed had already come to light. The girl was exposing herself now, clinging to what she believed was power. Arrogance. "You may collect your belongings and leave the hotel today," Ronald said. His voice didn't boom, but it was firm enough. Brittany didn't respond. She turned, yanked her lanyard free, and slammed it onto the desk. Her final glance across the lobby was a cold glare directed at Calvin, but he just stood there, unmoved, with an expression that didn't retaliate or flinch, his gaze toward her, cool, steady, and unmistakably clear. Carried one message. Arrogance cannot hide the truth, and the mask of the model employee had fallen, right in front of everyone. Brittany wheeled her suitcase out of the hotel like a shadow fleeing the spotlight, and in the space that had once been her stage of pride, a hush fell. No one applauded, but everyone knew. Something had shifted in the air, and it was no small thing. Once Brittany disappeared behind the revolving glass doors, Ronald felt as if a weight had finally lifted from his chest. He returned to his office, his hands still trembling as he unlocked the door. But what he didn't expect was that Calvin was already inside, leaning casually against the filing cabinet, his gaze calm in a way that was quietly unsettling. "I did it," Ronald said, his voice hoarse. "I let her go, just like you wanted." Calvin didn't nod. He didn't offer praise. He simply looked at the man as though still measuring something unspoken. "Good," Calvin replied. "But that was just the surface." Ronald swallowed hard. "Do you understand what you just did?" Calvin stepped forward slowly, each step making the man shrink slightly in his chair, as if on trial. "You just cut out a tumor. But you forgot you were the one feeding it every day." Ronald opened his mouth, but no words came. "I read every report," Calvin continued. "You knew about the problem for a long time, but you never took action. No warnings, no escalation, no retraining. You chose the easiest path. Silence and cover-up." Ronald sank into his chair, gripping the edge of the desk tightly. I didn't realize it had gotten that bad." Calvin studied him for a long moment, then exhaled a soft breath. "You didn't know, or you didn't want to know?" That question didn't need an answer. Ronald knew better than anyone. He hadn't been blind. He had simply chosen to look away, to preserve the illusion that everything was under control. And now, that illusion had shattered. Calvin pulled a thin envelope from his jacket pocket and placed it on the desk. "This is your reassignment notice. You're no longer the branch manager of Sterling Haven. You'll be evaluated at the central office. If you pass internal review, you might be offered another chance, but here, you won't." Ronald took the envelope but didn't open it. His face held no expression. Calvin said nothing more. He turned and walked out, gently closing the door behind him, leaving behind a man sitting in silence, newly unseated from the position he had assumed would last forever. In the hallway, the midday sun streamed through the tall glass panes, casting long streaks of light across the polished stone floor. Calvin paused for a moment, not out of regret, but because he knew. Forgiveness is a powerful thing, but it cannot be offered to those unwilling to face the consequences of the harm they allowed. Less than 30 minutes after Ronald's reassignment, Calvin returned to the hotel lobby. This time he was no longer the man in a hoodie moving quietly through the crowd. He stood tall, his eyes sharp as blades, holding the direct landline reserved for management at the front desk. A few employees flinched in surprise, but no one dared to stop him. There was something in his demeanor that made people afraid to ask. He dialed an internal line. The voice on the other end came through clearly. "Sterling Haven Operations Center, how may I assist you?" Calvin spoke each word like a tolling bell. "This is Calvin Brooks. I am ordering the immediate closure of Sterling Haven Branch 6 for a full operational audit. All guest complaints from the past 6 months must be reviewed. Any customer who was mistreated is to receive a full refund and immediate membership upgrade." The lobby fell completely silent. A woman paused mid-bite over her salad. A server nearly dropped a tray of drinks. Everyone was looking at him. A young employee whispered, confused, "Wait, what did he say his name was?" Calvin turned and smiled with the calm of someone who had no need to boast. "I'm Calvin Brooks." The moment those 3 words were spoken, it was as if the air had been split open. A woman gasped quietly, "Oh my God, it's really him." A bellboy dropped his cap. The truth shattered in an instant. The seemingly ordinary guest who had been denied check-in just the day before was the founder of the entire hotel chain they worked for. Calvin looked around. He didn't need to say more. His silence before, and the authority in his voice now, had taught everyone in that room a powerful lesson. The most powerful person in the room may very well be the one you once dismissed. He hung up the phone, placing the receiver back with a small click, but the echo of that sound lingered long after. No one spoke. Because deep down, everyone was beginning to examine themselves. Calvin didn't beat his chest. He didn't shout commands. He simply said softly, like a message left hanging in the air, "From today on, everything here will change." Then he turned and walked away, his shoes striking steady, resonant steps across the cold marble floor. He did not look back, because behind him was a team that had just been awakened. Room 913 was still wrapped in its familiar silence when Calvin returned at the end of the day. The late afternoon light filtered through the thick curtain, casting shadows across the cold tile floor and the simple wooden table. He sat down and opened his laptop once more, but this time not to track down who was at fault, but to begin rebuilding from the roots. Inside the executive-level management system, Calvin began typing the first commands. Brittany Ellis, permanently removed from the employee database, with a lifetime ban from ever being rehired at any branch. Ronald Spears, temporarily reassigned, status marked as under ethical review. Next, he turned to the customer records. Every single person who had ever filed a complaint, every guest who had been turned away, every concern that had gone unanswered. Calvin read them all. He didn't just read, he acknowledged. Each case was handled individually, refunds issued, formal apologies written, lifetime membership upgrades granted, not because he wanted to salvage the company's image, but because those people, at some point, had believed in his service and were then betrayed by the very system that promised to serve them. When the final steps were complete, Calvin leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen as it slowly dimmed. He didn't smile. He didn't exhale in relief. He simply sat in silence, because he understood. Building an empire is hard, but keeping its soul intact is even harder. And if no one is willing to get their hands dirty to clean it, that empire will eventually rot from within. A soft knock on the door broke the quiet. It was his personal assistant. She had arrived after hearing the news. "The board is waiting for your confirmation on the report," she said. Calvin nodded without looking up. "Let them wait." He poured himself a glass of water, not wine, not champagne. Just water, the purest thing after a day thick with dust. "I don't need their approval. What I need is for the staff here to understand this. From now on, service is not just emotion, it is an attitude. Respect is not a slogan, it is a principle." He stood, walked to the window, and once again pulled the curtain aside. The trash yard was still there. No miracle had swept it away overnight. But something within him had shifted. If he had to start again, he would start from the lowest point. And if this system needed someone to protect its original values, he was ready to be that person, every single day. Behind every five-star hotel lies an invisible world. A single cold glance can destroy trust. But sometimes, one timely act can reignite the light of an entire empire. In the world of business, processes can be digitized and systems can be automated. But kindness must never be taken for granted. A great brand is not defined by its logo or signage, but by how it treats the smallest individual who walks through its doors. And sometimes, to fix an organization, we don't need more rules. We just need someone willing to return to the place where everything first began to slip away. If you believe that respect is the most enduring foundation of any service journey, then, like this video, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss stories that speak to the core of what truly matters, and leave a comment with the phrase, "Hold the root," because what keeps a customer isn't the price, but the way we choose to treat them.